Welcome to the Trackpad's Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The story of Eugene Bullard begins not in the clouds, but in the sweltering heat of the American South, where the weight of Jim Crow laws pressed down like an unrelenting burden. Born in 1895 in Columbus, Georgia, he came of age in a world where racial violence could flare at any moment and where opportunity was as scarce as money in a sharecropper's pocket. For young Eugene, even childhood was marked by the knowledge that he would be judged not for his character, but for his skin. Yet he inherited from his father a belief in dignity and a dream of France, a place spoken of almost as myth, where freedom and respect were possible. That dream would become the spark that carried him across the Atlantic and into history. He was destined not to bend to the circumstances into which he was born, but to carve out a life of courage and audacity that few could have imagined. When most people hear the legends of the First World War in the air, the names they recall are familiar. Eddie Rickenbacker, America's celebrated ace, or Manfred von Richthofen, the feared Red Baron. Yet lost beneath those names is another figure, a man who became the first black American combat aviator, though not under his own country's flag. Eugene Bullard's homeland denied him the chance to fly, denied him even the acknowledgement of his service. But France opened its doors and offered him both wings and a place in its ranks. In France, he was a soldier, a pilot, and a decorated veteran. In America, he was invisible. His life illustrates not only the daring of aviation's early years, but also the injustice of memory. Who is honored, who is ignored, and why? To tell Bullard's story is to pull him out of the shadows where history left him. Bullard's life was filled with stark contrasts that illuminate his character. In the trenches, he endured the hell of mud, barbed wire, and artillery, fighting as a legionnaire alongside men from across the globe. Those days demanded grit and resilience, the ability to carry on through exhaustion and terror. But in the skies above Verdun, he found another kind of war. Clean, open, and swift, where duels were fought in fragile machines of wood and canvas. Few men experienced both extremes, and fewer still lived them as a black American in a time when prejudice sought to define his worth. Yet Eugene carried himself with steady composure, refusing to be broken by the mud or humbled by the clouds. His story is not only about survival, but about defying the barriers imposed on him by both circumstance and society. This episode will trace the arc of a man who lived many lives in one. We will follow him from his boyhood escape from Georgia to the streets of Paris, where boxing gloves gave him his first taste of independence. We will march with him into the trenches of the Foreign Legion and then climb with him into the cockpit of a French fighter, where his aircraft bore the motto, "All blood runs red." We will see him reinvent himself in Parisian nightclubs and take up arms again when fascism threatened the world a second time. And finally, we will reckon with his legacy, overlooked by the United States until long after his death, yet remembered in France with honor. Eugene Bullard's journey is more than biography. It is a story of resilience, courage, and the timeless truth that bravery belongs to no single race or nation. Eugene Bullard's roots lay deep in the red clay soil of Georgia, where he was born in 1895, the seventh of 10 children in a family that lived under the crushing hand of Jim Crow. Life in Columbus was harsh, marked by segregation that governed every interaction and by violence that could erupt without warning. Bullard's father, William, carried himself with quiet pride despite working as a laborer, and he instilled in his children a belief that they were more than the world told them they could be. From his father, Eugene heard stories about France, a country that had abolished slavery long before America and where men of African descent had found respect. For a boy whose childhood was punctuated by fear and humiliation, the idea of such a place was magnetic. France became not just a faraway land, but a vision of freedom, a destination that grew into a life's mission. By the time Eugene was 11, that vision burned so strongly that he tried to run away. His first attempts failed, ending in return to the same oppressive streets he longed to escape, but they revealed the determination that would define his life. The brutality of Georgia's racial order left him no illusions about what his future held if he stayed. With each passing year, his frustration grew, fed by the constant reminders that he was unwelcome in the land of his birth. At 16, he made his boldest attempt yet. Hiding aboard a merchant ship bound for Europe, he left behind everything familiar, chasing the promise of a better world across the Atlantic. The risk was immense, but to Eugene, remaining in Georgia felt like a slow death. The ship's voyage marked the first step in a journey that would carry him into history. Landing in Scotland, Eugene faced a new kind of hardship. He was a stranger in a foreign land, poor, without connections, and speaking only fragments of English colored by the American South. He survived by working odd jobs cleaning, hauling, and any labor that earned a few coins. Yet hardship sharpened his resourcefulness, and soon he found a way to channel his natural toughness into something more lucrative: boxing. The sport offered him more than money. It gave him mobility. Traveling with the boxing circuit, he could move from town to town, and eventually, country to country. In the ring, he learned discipline, strategy, and endurance, the same qualities that would later serve him in war. Fighting for purses against bigger, more experienced men, he found not only survival but pride. The boxing world toughened his body and sharpened his spirit for the challenges ahead. Eventually, his travels carried him to Paris, the city his father had described with reverence. For Eugene, stepping into Paris was like crossing a threshold into possibility. Here, the color of his skin did not carry the same immediate barriers as in Georgia. He found work, friendships, and a sense of belonging he had never known. In Montmartre, with its crowded streets and music drifting from cafes, he discovered a community where art and culture thrived, and where he could reinvent himself. France had become more than a dream. It was home. Yet just as he was beginning to build a life, Europe was shaken by war in 1914. For Bullard, who owed France a debt of belonging, the decision was clear. He would fight for the country that had given him dignity, even if it meant trading the gloves of a boxer for the rifle of a soldier. When Eugene Bullard arrived in Paris, the city seemed like a living dream compared to the harsh streets of Georgia. It was alive with music, art, and a cosmopolitan energy that embraced people from across the world. Bullard settled into Montmartre, a neighborhood already famous for its bohemian character. Here he found a place where skin color did not define every encounter, where talent and charm could open doors closed to him in America. He supported himself with odd jobs and the occasional boxing match, slowly weaving himself into the fabric of the community. For the first time, he felt what it meant to be judged for who he was, not what society dictated he should be. This sense of freedom fueled him, convincing him that France was not just a refuge but the place where he could build a life. Boxing became his foothold. The sport was popular in Paris, and Bullard's toughness earned him matches that provided both money and notoriety. In the smoky venues of Montmartre, he found an audience eager to cheer skill and bravery regardless of background. Victories in the ring offered more than prizes. They gave him a sense of belonging. He was not merely surviving, he was becoming part of something larger. The discipline of training, the rhythm of the fights, and the camaraderie among fighters reinforced his growing confidence. Paris gave him not only a stage, but also a community that appreciated his resilience. The young man who had once been a stowaway now walked proudly through the same streets as artists, musicians, and intellectuals who defined an era. Then the summer of 1914 shattered the city's rhythm. The assassination in Sarajevo ignited tensions that had long simmered, and Europe slid rapidly into war. Paris transformed almost overnight, shifting from gaiety to grim determination. Posters calling for volunteers plastered walls, and young men lined up outside recruitment offices. For Bullard, the choice to enlist was immediate and deeply personal. France had offered him freedom and dignity. Now he would offer his service in return. When he joined the French Foreign Legion, he was stepping into an institution designed for outsiders and adventurers, a natural home for someone who had always lived between worlds. The decision was not taken lightly. It meant embracing danger, hardship, and the possibility of death. But Bullard was resolute. His life had always been about defying the odds, and this was the next test. Legion training introduced him to a new world of discipline and endurance. The Foreign Legion was a melting pot of languages, nationalities, and motives, but all were bound together by strict rules and relentless drills. Bullard learned to march long distances under heavy packs, to handle the level rifle with precision, and to function as part of a unit where loyalty was non-negotiable. It was a harsh environment, but one that rewarded toughness and resolve qualities Bullard had in abundance. He quickly proved himself dependable, a man who could endure the grueling pace without complaint. In the camaraderie of the Legion, he found echoes of the boxing fraternity, but here the stakes were far higher. Every lesson, every hour of drill, was preparation for the front lines that awaited them. When the Legionnaires received their orders to move toward the front, Bullard felt the weight of his decision fully settle on his shoulders. Paris was behind him now, replaced by the grim reality of war. The camaraderie, the drills, and the pride of belonging to the Legion had prepared him, but nothing could erase the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He was no longer simply a stowaway, a boxer, or an expatriate. He was a soldier of France, sworn to defend its soil against the German tide. For Eugene Bullard, the war was no longer an abstraction in the newspapers. It was a destiny he had chosen, and it would test him in ways he could scarcely imagine. The first taste of the front was a harsh awakening for Eugene Bullard and his fellow legionnaires. Gone were the orderly drills and the discipline of the training grounds. In their place lay a world of mud, filth, and terror. The march to the trenches took them through ruined villages, where shattered church steeples jutted like broken teeth, and farm fields had been churned into swamps by artillery. At night the horizon flickered with distant flashes, each boom of the guns a reminder of the destruction awaiting them. Bullard's regiment was sent to some of the toughest sectors, for the Foreign Legion was often tasked with holding ground where losses were expected. To the young soldier it felt as if he had stepped into a living nightmare, yet there was no turning back. The reality of war was now under his boots, and in the air he breathed. Life in the trenches quickly revealed itself as a war of endurance. Mud clung to every step, soaking boots and uniforms until they felt like lead. Rats swarmed through the dugouts, feeding on scraps and sometimes on the dead. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with cordite and decay, a constant presence that no man could escape. Bullard, hardened by years of struggle, adapted as best he could. He learned to conserve his energy, to share small comforts with his comrades, and to keep his rifle clean even when everything else was caked in grime. Nights were spent in anxious silence, broken by the whine of shells or the sudden crack of rifle fire. In those moments, survival hinged on instinct and luck as much as training. Combat came in brutal bursts. Orders would send the legionnaires clambering out of their trenches into no man's land, crawling through barbed wire and advancing under fire. Bullard witnessed men fall around him, sometimes crying out, sometimes silent, and he pressed on with the grim knowledge that hesitation meant death. In one attack, shrapnel tore into him, knocking him to the ground and sending him into darkness. When he awoke, it was in a field hospital, bandaged and weak but alive. His wounds could have sent him home, but his resolve was unbroken. The French recognized his courage with the Croix de Guerre, a medal pinned to his uniform as proof of valor. To Eugene, the honor mattered less than the chance to return to his comrades, for he had found a sense of brotherhood in the Legion that he had never known in America. The experience hardened him in ways nothing else could. Bullard became known as a steady presence, the kind of soldier others trusted in the chaos of battle. He carried himself with quiet determination, never boasting, never faltering, even when fear clawed at every man's heart. The Foreign Legion demanded sacrifice, and Eugene had given both blood and strength, but it also gave him a reputation as a fighter whose courage could be relied upon. For a young man who had once fled the streets of Georgia in search of dignity, the trenches of France were a cruel proving ground, yet one where he carved out an identity as a soldier of worth. In the mud, amid the roar of guns, he had earned his place among warriors. It was during his recovery that Bullard glimpsed a new horizon. Pilots spoke of life above the front, of machines that lifted men from the mud and gave them the sky. To a man who had always sought freedom, the lure was irresistible. He began to dream not just of returning to the trenches, but of breaking free from them entirely. The air service represented speed, autonomy, and a chance to fight on his own terms. Submitting his request to transfer into aviation, Eugene Bullard took the first step toward rewriting not only his own destiny, but also a chapter of history. The soldier who had endured mud and shrapnel was now determined to rise into the open skies. The transition from infantryman to aviator began in the classrooms of the French Air Service, where Eugene Bullard found himself poring over chalkboards, filled with diagrams of wings, propellers, and airflow. It was a stark contrast to the trenches, yet no less demanding. Instructors drilled recruits in the principles of aerodynamics, the mechanics of engines, and the intricacies of navigation. For many, the challenge was intellectual as much as physical, but Bullard approached it with the same determination he had once shown in the boxing ring and the Legion. He had already proven that grit and focus could carry him through impossible odds, and now those qualities became his tools for mastering the art of flight. Each lesson was another step toward the cockpit, where theory would give way to practice and survival. The day of his first solo flight was one he would never forget. Strapped into a fragile trainer with its fabric wings and sputtering rotary engine, Bullard felt both exhilaration and terror. The ground crew steadied the plane as the engine roared to life, the vibration rattling his bones. When the chocks were pulled away, the aircraft lurched forward, bumping across the grass before finally lifting into the air. For the first time, Bullard was free of the mud and wire of the trenches, soaring above fields and villages scarred by war. Every movement of the stick and rudder was a conversation with the machine, each adjustment a test of balance between gravity and lift. By the time he landed, his nerves were raw, but he had proven to himself, and to his instructors, that he could master the sky. The Nieuport fighter became his machine, a sleek, lightweight biplane that demanded both respect and finesse. Its agility made it deadly in the right hands, but its thin frame and rotary engine left little room for error. Bullard treated it with the seriousness of a boxer studying an opponent, learning its strengths and quirks through repetition. He discovered how to climb quickly into the sun to gain an advantage, how to dive sharply without tearing the wings, and how to coax the engine through long patrols. The Nieuport was not just wood, wire, and fabric. It was a partner in survival, as alive in its way as the men who strapped themselves into it. Bullard's bond with the aircraft became an extension of his fighting spirit, carrying him into a new form of battle. Life in the squadron was its own world, shaped by routine and tension. Days began with briefings over maps, where patrols were assigned and weather studied. Hours of waiting followed, punctuated by the sudden call to scramble. Between flights, men gathered in mess tents, swapping stories, playing cards, or simply smoking in silence. Mechanics labored endlessly to keep fragile machines in the air, while ground crews readied weapons and fuel. Bullard was not the only foreigner. Americans, Canadians, and others filled the rosters, but he stood apart as the only black pilot. Prejudices lingered, but his steadiness and skill gradually earned him respect. In the air, every pilot depended on the others, and survival left little room for petty divisions. On the side of his Nieuport, Bullard painted the words that defined his mission: "All blood runs red." The motto was both a declaration and a challenge, a reminder that death in the skies did not distinguish between men. It was a message to comrades and enemies alike, that courage belonged to no single race, and that sacrifice erased the divisions imposed by society. Each time he climbed into the cockpit, those words traveled with him, carried across the front as both defiance and truth. In the roar of the engine and the rush of wind, they were more than paint. They were the creed of a man who had risen above the mud to fight on equal terms in the open sky. The skies above the front were at once vast and claustrophobic, a domain where the smallest error could send a pilot spiraling to his death. For Eugene Bullard, The first combat sorties were a test of nerve and instinct. Patrols meant flying in formation over trenches and ruined villages, scanning constantly for enemy aircraft that could appear like phantoms out of the clouds. At times, the missions were uneventful, hours of cold wind and engine noise. At other times, they erupted in sudden chaos as German fighters dived out of the sun, or balloons bristling with defenses became the focus of deadly attacks. In every case, Bullard learned quickly that survival required both composure and aggression, the ability to act decisively without being reckless. Dogfighting was unlike any battle Bullard had known in the trenches. It demanded 3 dimensions of awareness: altitude, speed, and position, all changing in an instant. The fragile Nieuport demanded constant control, its light frame groaning under sharp turns and steep dives. Bullard treated each encounter as a contest of patience and timing. He learned to keep the sun at his back, to conserve energy for the right moment, and to fire short, precise bursts when his sights aligned. These were duels fought at close range, where the face of an enemy pilot might be visible for a fleeting second before vanishing into smoke or cloud. Each fight left him exhausted, but also sharpened his skill and confidence. One of the most dangerous assignments was balloon busting, attacking the tethered observation balloons that directed enemy artillery. These balloons were heavily defended, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and patrolled by fighters. Attacking them meant flying straight into concentrated fire, the canvas skin of the Nieuport offering little more protection than paper. Bullard, like others in his squadron, knew the risks, but also understood the importance of the mission. Balloons controlled the battlefield far more effectively than any single pilot, and bringing them down could save countless lives below. The courage required for such missions cemented his reputation among comrades as a man willing to face the worst dangers. Yet recognition in the air war was a slippery prize. French regulations demanded multiple witnesses to confirm an aerial victory, and in the confusion of combat, many kills went unverified. Bullard's official record showed only a handful of confirmed victories, but fellow pilots believed he had downed more than was acknowledged. The lack of recognition mirrored the larger struggle of his life bravery displayed, yet not always recorded or rewarded. For Eugene, what mattered most was not the tally of victories, but the trust of his squadron and the knowledge that he had done his part. He carried out his missions with professionalism, embodying the same steadiness that had earned him medals as an infantryman. The physical strain of flying took its toll. Hours at altitude left his hands numb from cold, despite heavy gloves, his eyes stinging from the wind. The constant roar of engines battered his hearing, while the vibration of the controls left his body aching. Fatigue became a constant companion, yet there was no rest. Each dawn brought new missions, each evening new losses. Bullard's resilience, honed through years of struggle, allowed him to endure where others faltered. But he was not immune to the cost of the war. Every empty chair in the mess tent, every missing face on patrol, reminded him of how precarious survival was. The war in the skies offered freedom from mud and trenches, but it exacted its own merciless price. For Bullard, the greatest irony was that while France celebrated his service, his homeland ignored it. He wore medals on his chest, carried the respect of comrades, and flew with honor. Yet in the United States, his achievements were unrecognized. Still, each time he climbed into his aircraft, he carried with him a truth no prejudice could erase. In combat, courage was the only currency, and by that measure, he was the equal of any man. His motto, "All blood runs red," was not just philosophy, but lived reality, written in the exhaust trails across the sky and the graves of comrades from every nation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Eugene Bullard returned to Paris wearing medals that testified to his service. Yet, he carried something heavier than decorations: the knowledge that his own country would not recognize what he had achieved. Attempts to join the fledgling U.S. Army Air Service had already been rejected on the grounds of race, and the end of the war did nothing to soften that barrier. For a man who had risked everything in the skies of France, the denial was both bitter and clarifying. America was not ready to see him as a pilot, but Paris still welcomed him as a veteran and as part of its vibrant cultural fabric. It was in France that he would once again reinvent himself, this time not as a soldier but as a figure in the world of music and nightlife. Paris in the 1920s pulsed with energy, and Bullard was at its center. He opened clubs and cabarets in Montmartre, places where the sounds of Harlem jazz mingled with French rhythms, creating a scene that drew artists, musicians, and intellectuals from across the globe. Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, and countless others passed through his doors, making his establishments hubs of both entertainment and community. The man who had once flown combat missions now poured drinks and booked bands, but he was still a leader, still a man whose presence commanded respect. For many African Americans who came to Paris, Bullard became a symbol of what was possible abroad, a life lived with dignity, success, and recognition, even when denied at home. The interwar years also revealed Bullard's continued loyalty to France. As fascism rose in Germany, French authorities relied on his connections and discretion, asking him to monitor the activities of German operatives who frequented his clubs. It was a different kind of service, quieter but no less risky, and one that spoke to the trust he had earned. Bullard moved through smoky back rooms and crowded dance halls, listening, observing, and passing information along. The soldier had become an informant, his battlefield now the nightlife of Paris, but the mission was the same: defending the country that had accepted him. When war clouds gathered again in 1939, there was never a question in his mind about what he would do. In 1940, as German tanks rolled into France, Bullard once again put on a uniform, though by then he was older and carrying the scars of earlier battles. He fought in the desperate defense of France, taking up arms alongside men young enough to be his sons. During the retreat, he was wounded once more, adding another scar to a body already marked by shrapnel and strain. For Eugene, the pattern was clear. When France was in danger, he stood with her, no matter the cost. Even defeat did not break that bond. Forced to flee with his family as German troops advanced, he left behind his clubs, his community, and the life he had built. Carrying only the essentials and the memories of another war survived. Exile brought him back to the United States, but not to the recognition or security one might expect for a man of his record. In New York, he lived in near anonymity, working as an elevator operator and laborer to support his family. The medals of France lay tucked away while he earned a modest living, unseen and uncelebrated. It was a humbling end to a life of extraordinary service, yet Bullard carried himself with quiet dignity. France continued to honor him, awarding him the Legion of Honor and inviting him to ceremonies, but in America, he was just another working man in Harlem. The pilot who had once flown under the motto, "All blood runs red," lived his final years as if history had forgotten him, though he never let bitterness define his character. Eugene Bullard's story is not just a biography, but a mirror held up to the contradictions of the 20th century. In France, he was celebrated as a decorated infantryman and aviator, a man whose courage was acknowledged with medals and respect. In America, he was invisible, barred from opportunity by the color of his skin, and left to live in obscurity. This contrast sharpened the meaning of his life. A man could give his blood and risk his life for freedom, yet still be denied recognition by the very country that claimed to value it. Bullard's existence exposes the fault lines of history, the spaces where bravery and injustice collide, and where memory is slow to catch up with truth. It was not until decades after his death in 1961 that America began to correct its silence. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force posthumously commissioned him as a second lieutenant, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged what France had recognized 80 years earlier. Monuments, biographies, and documentaries followed, lifting his story out of the shadows. Yet even these honors could not erase the long years he spent forgotten. The delay in recognition underscores a painful truth, that some heroes must wait generations for their due. For Bullard, the honors came too late to be worn on his chest, but they ensured that his name would no longer be missing from the rolls of aviation history. His motto, "All blood runs red," remains the most enduring element of his legacy. Painted on the side of his Nieuport, it was more than a slogan. It was a creed forged in the trenches, proven in the air, and lived in his daily choices. It reminds us that courage is universal, that sacrifice ignores the divisions of race, and that honor belongs to those who rise when called. Every trench he held, every sortie he flew, and every act of defiance in the face of prejudice reaffirmed those words. His life teaches that equality is not granted but demonstrated, again and again, through action. Today, when we remember Eugene Bullard, we are called to see him not as an exception, but as an example. He was a pioneer who broke barriers, a soldier who never wavered, and a man who found dignity where his own country denied it. His story enriches the larger narrative of the First World War and the generations of aviators who followed. More importantly, it offers a lesson for all time, that the measure of a person lies not in the restrictions placed upon them, but in the heights they reach despite them. In honoring Bullard, we honor the truth that courage belongs to everyone, and that in the crucible of battle, all blood truly runs red.
Thank you for joining us on the TrackPad's Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.